We're going to begin our discussion of Egypt, one of my personal favorites. When I got into art history, I actually considered being an Egyptologist until I really thought about it for a while and thought, that's a lot of living in the desert and a lot of archaeology, which is something that is a little too maybe perhaps systematic for my humanities brain. And so instead, I decided to become the contemporary art historian that I am. But because of this early fascination with Egypt, my fascination sort of continued right into my greater career as an art historian. I also like talking about Egypt because I find that most of my students have at least some cursory or introductory sort of level experience with Egypt. You've seen it in a movie, right? You've seen it maybe on a History Channel special. You have some background of Egypt, so it's a little bit more fun to speak about because I feel that the students are a little bit more dialed in or connected to this material than perhaps other material that we touch upon. So we'll start out with our map. Always important to have a sense of place, where are we at? And Egypt is located on the continent of Africa, of course. But interestingly enough, it is the only African culture to be considered Western, not non Western. So it's an interesting conundrum sometimes, which is why a lot of art historians have moved away from even talking about Western and non Western art in that kind of vein. For instance, at TCC, I actually teach a class that until this coming fall is going to be called, it used to be called non Western art. I actually lobbied to have the name changed to Art of the World because I just felt that Western non Western was a little old fashioned. But the old school kind of idea was that there was the Western world, mainly the European world, right? And then everything else, which was considered non Western. African art is considered non Western, but Egypt, of course, is part of the Western world because it was the beginnings of civilization in the West, right? Because of course we know civilization occurred other places as well. So again, it's interesting to talk about the Egyptians and their place geographically because they are located on the continent of Africa, but again are framed within the context of European culture to a certain extent. So you have to sort of rectify right those two things against one another when studying Egypt and recognize the inherent issues right of that conversation. So we're in northern Africa here, right, looking at Egypt. And I picked a map where we're zoomed in a little bit more onto the Nile River, right, and the cities around the Nile. Notice that the Nile River is the most prominent geographic characteristic, right, for Egyptians, and they frame their cities around it. So just like the Mesopotamians, they're thinking about this idea of water as life, right? That water gives you life, it gives you what you need to survive. So if you actually look at the map, you'll notice most cities are arrayed, right, around right the Nile. That's just the way it worked. It worked that way then, it works that way now. And it leads also the Nile to certain namings, right, that the Egyptians will use. For instance, the idea of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. The sort of geographical way we talk about Egypt comes from the flow of the Nile. Now, the Nile, it flows beginning right up towards its apex, sort of at the beginning of the top of the map here, right? I'm sorry, at the bottom of the map for us. And it flows right northward right into the Mediterranean Sea where it empties out down here. So, where normally we think of sort of the idea of up here would be upper, down here would be lower, notice for Egyptians is actually flipped. This would be Upper Egypt, this would be Lower Egypt because of the flow of the Nile, right? So it flows northward to empty out into the into the Mediterranean Sea. So again, when Egyptians use these geographical markers, it's a little bit flipped perhaps in our mind from what we actually think of as the cardinal directions, but we're following the flow of the Nile. Now, why tell you about Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt at all? Because Egypt will be broken apart at various times in its history. If you actually look at the flow of Egyptian time, you have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, and the pre-dynastic period that comes before it. In between the kingdoms, you have these intermediate periods. Now, we're not going to get like that complex, right? We're just going to basically talk about the kingdoms primarily. But I wanted you to understand when these dynastic periods sort of fell apart into the intermediate periods, often what the Egyptians would do would become very fragmented and they'd go back to this old school sort of Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt talk. We'll look at a pre dynastic monument called the Palette of Narmer that shows the unification of Egypt. But again, that unification won't be permanent throughout their history. They often will have this dissolution or this falling apart that will happen. So often they'll go back to more of this regionality in their speech of like, well, we're Upper Egyptians, we're Lower Egyptians. I'll show you how that's actually visualized in art. So again, why do you need to know this? Because it shows up in art as well. So keep these terms, these geographical terms in mind and how they actually apply to the map as well. They also thought about the idea of red earth, black earth. We talked about this idea in Mesopotamia of like a lot of the gods were elemental. And a lot of things these people talk about is about, sort of basic needs, agriculture, right? You need the sun, the moon, the rain, right? The earth. So notice that for them, the earth shows up a lot in their speech, just like the water is going to be important to them, the earth's going to be important to them as well. So the red earth actually relates to the idea of Upper Egypt, and it would have been this area up here, which was much more desert-like and arid. And then the black earth would relate to Lower Egypt, this area down here in what we call the Nile Delta, which is like the fan, the alluvial fan that you see down here. The river, you'll notice it starts to branch out into all these tributaries essentially. And the delta regions are always very fertile regions when you study rivers, right, in agriculture. So that earth would have been much more black or more fertile. So sometimes they would also use like Upper Egypt, red earth together, or Lower Egypt and black earth together, right, to talk about their regionality as well. But again, always keep in mind the Nile, the river, the orientation when thinking about how they speak about themselves geographically. Now, we also are able to talk about the Egyptians in more depth because just like the Mesopotamians, they had writing. We talked about cuneiform is actually sort of difficult because there's no key. Hieroglyphs, a little more easy to deal with, right? And you'll notice that hieroglyphs literally translates to the idea of holy writing. Hieroglyphos, holy writing. Um, and why call them hieroglyphs? Because the people understood that the people who wrote at this time were considered special or sacred in some kind of way. Most people who could write were usually either priests or we assume like higher level people in the hierarchy of power, right? So a very very small amount of people who could write. Just like in Mesopotamia, literacy was going to be a skill that not many people actually had. So yes, they could read and write in a sense, right? They could be literate in that sense, but very few people were actually capable of those skills. Again, if we had to estimate, we'd say maybe 10 to 20% of the population. That's maybe tops. So again, just because they were literate doesn't really mean that was something most people could do. So to them, writing probably was like a sacred act, something almost magical, perhaps, which leads to this idea again of holy writing. You can see some hieroglyphs here. You'll notice they're much more pictographic than cuneiform. So we talked about pictographic writing is the use of pictures or symbols as a form of writing. It's different than phonetic writing that English uses, let's say. And again, these are a little bit more obvious than what you see with the cuneiformic pictographs. But I noted before that pictographs are paired with phonograms. When we look at the palette of Narmer, I'll get a little bit more into this and tell you about a phonogram and how it relates to the pictogram. So we'll see it kind of visually explained. But this idea that the pictures had to be paired with sounds. So pictographic writing obviously is a bit more of a complex system because you have to learn both the pictogram and the phonogram and then how to put them together. Where learning phonetics is a little bit like you learn the initial phonetics and then you just build words, right? It's a little bit different. And I'd say pictographic writing is harder because again, you kind of almost have to memorize two different things. So, we'll talk a little bit about the pictograms and phonograms and how they work together. Now, the hieroglyphs, why are they easier for us to use, right, when we study Egyptian culture? Because there is a key. So, unlike cuneiform, there's a key we can use. It's called the Rosetta Stone. You're seeing a picture of it here. And you'll note that there are three different types of writing on it. At the top, you have hieroglyphs. At the bottom, you have Greek. In the middle, you have this almost vernacular type of Greek called Demotic Greek. Unless you're a linguist, you don't really need to worry about this. Now, if you're a linguist and you want to go down that rabbit hole, feel free. But really, for us, the hieroglyphs on the top and the Greek on the bottom are what we should consider here. So, how does this work? The Rosetta Stone basically is from a later portion of Egyptian history. If you look at the end of Egyptian history, you have some outside people coming in to rule Egypt. You have the Phoenicians, you have the Greeks, and you have the Romans. In our class, I don't study those periods with you because, again, I consider them outside, leaderships, basically. For our purposes, we stop at the end of the New Kingdom. We don't go into these periods. So this is from a later period, right, when the Greeks were in control of Egypt. And what we think they were trying to do is write a message to the people in the way that was going to reach as many people as possible. So the people that could speak Greek, they could read it. The people who spoke kind of maybe the slangy vernacular Demotic, they could read it. And then the people who were born and bred Egyptian and preferred hieroglyphs, they could read it as well. So it was kind of a triple, messaging system of how can you reach as many people. Now, how does this work as a key? We know Greek and we know how to translate it and we know how to read it. It's never been a lost language to us. So you can translate the Greek and then go back and use it to try to translate the hieroglyphs. So it works as a key. Also, if you've ever learned languages and used the Rosetta Stone Company, you now know why the heck it's called that, in case you didn't before. Because this is what we call kind of the first key to language, where it's a language that was not really understood properly until the Rosetta Stone helped to unlock it and helped for people to put together the idea of what do the hieroglyphs mean with the Greek text and then go from there to translate it. So it's a pretty valuable find.